It doesn't surprise me that the United States has a share of giving that is well above ours. It's more than 3 times at the individual level. What does surprise me is that New Zealand is way ahead of us. I'm amazed by that.
In New Zealand, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, if you're registered as a charity, you do get their equivalent of a tax break. The reason that this could be very significant is that Treasury is estimating that in today's dollars, by 2059, $130 billion will be passing as people die.
Per year.
Yeah, and it's going up, but if you've got 10% of that, it's 13 billion. And as I was telling you before, that's our total giving now.
Yeah.
If you've got 5%, it's 6.5, and that's a pretty good annual yield, right?
I've got the slogan for you, which is you can't take it with you.
Correct.
Yep.
You can't take it with you.
Welcome to another edition of it may not be my favourite podcast, it's got my favourite name, Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. I have a new guest and his name is Sam Rosevear. He is the Executive Director for Policy, Government Relations and Research at Philanthropy Australia. I once had a discussion with Henry Ergas and said if we could pick up every $100 bill sitting on the pavement, we'd be doing a lot better. That's mainly where I think about when I think about public policy, what is a no-brainer, what is something we should obviously do, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I will now introduce Sam. He'll tell us a little more about us, and then he'll tell us about that $100 bill on the pavement. Sam.
Well, Nicholas, thanks so much for inviting me on and particularly to talk about this incredible opportunity to work with the government to double giving to charity by 2030, which was one of their lesser known election commitments, but a pretty historic one, talking about doubling giving to charity, which would be pretty significant. But just in terms of introducing myself, I'm a proud dad of Harry, the greatest living human on earth, alongside his mother, Melody, who is the CEO and founder of a great organisation called Teach for Australia. And my background very quickly is 15 years in the federal government and a lot of Treasury and PM&C and finance, and working on the budgets of the 2000s was a particular highlight. And I used to go to Cabinet in the Rudd years and engage and write the Green Brief, which you're probably familiar that ministers worked from when social services was on. And then marrying Melody, we moved to Melbourne, and I worked with Glyn Davis as his chief of staff and ran his office at the University of Melbourne, which was wonderful, a great man. Was a deputy secretary in the state government for a couple of years, and I've been on the senior exec teams at Headspace Beyond Blue. Worked with Melody at Teach for Australia for a couple of years, and I've been 2 years here at Philanthropy Australia. And the thread that runs through all of it is working to influence government to do incredibly good reforms, which is what excites me, whether it's, John Howard showing leadership and courage to do gun reform after the massacre, standing in front of farmers with a bulletproof vest on saying we've got to do this, or taking tax reform, difficult tax reform to the 1998 election, or whether it's the Hawke and Keating governments doing incredible things to set us up for a generation economically, and introducing small things like universal healthcare and the Medicare system and the wonderful system of superannuation. We didn't have a system.
You've hit a snag there. It is a wonderful system, but it's the way it's taxed is not wonderful, and there's more than $2 trillion in it. But anyway.
Free, I think. And
yes, that's right.
The fact that it does, ensure, retirements with dignity for many, many more people, I think is a really important thing. So they're the things that really excite me.
And now you want to get some money out of those superannuation funds and get that to people who might do better out of it. So let me just quickly summarize. When you say double giving, you're talking about that thing that most of us, I hope most of the viewers and listeners to this do, which is that maybe at tax time or at some time in the year, we give some money to people who we think could use it better than we can, as part of our sense that we live in a civilized society. That's, I think, according to your numbers, about half of the giving, and you might, because that's individual giving as a proportion of GDP, and you might be able to fill me in on what the total giving in Australia is about double that. I guess that's corporates, is it?
Yeah, look, the data's not great and it's a bit incomplete, but the best and latest estimates show that Australia gives at the rate of about $13 billion a year, or around about 0.8% of GDP.
Right, right.
That compares to Canada and the UK at 1% of GDP.
Yeah, I want to go on and talk about these comparisons. At the moment, I just want to sort of get sorted what we're trying to do. And so this is a part of the economy that is it's a small part of the economy. It's kind of less than 1%, but a very important part of the economy, because in terms of dollars and cents, it's, according to your numbers, 0.81% of GDP. But in terms of the well-being of Australians, it's going to be much more than that, because it's it's an important way we have of trying to deal with gross national suffering, if I can call it that, gross national disadvantage. It makes common sense, even if it has. You sometimes have to. The only people you have to explain this to is economists, really. That money in the hands of poor people is actually more valuable than money in the hands of rich people. It should be the other way around. That should be the sort of thing that economists quickly cotton onto. And they did at the turn of the 20th century. That was kind of core economics for the economists like Alfred Marshall, who wrote the textbooks of the time. But the 20th century, in an attempt to make to pretend that their discipline was a science, they balked at the idea that $1 for a poor person might be more valuable than $1 for a wealthy person. Anyway, so the idea is to try to double that, which sounds very dramatic. And then as we talked about it, it struck me that it shouldn't be that hard. Now, before we do that, before we talk about the ways in which we can do that, can you take? I've got the numbers from your presentation here, and they're quite shocking, actually. It doesn't surprise me that the United States has a share of giving that is well above ours. It's more than twice at that total level. It's more than 3 times at the individual level. That's, I think, worth thinking about and talking about, but it doesn't surprise me. What does surprise me is that New Zealand is way ahead of us. And I'm amazed by that. So anyway, again, the United Kingdom does better than us, a lot, not massively better, but substantially better, and Canada does quite a bit better. So do you want to tell us how reliable are those figures, do you think, and what's behind this phenomenon? I'm really quite intrigued by it.
Yeah. Well, the New Zealand figure at 1.84% of GDP is a really significant one, because we were mentioning before, Australia's at 0.8.
Yeah.
So if we were giving at the New Zealand rate,
yeah,
instead of 13 billion, you'd be giving 30 billion a year.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons we can feel a sense of confidence that we can do better.
So what things do you think make the New Zealand figure so much higher?
Well, I think when you're thinking about how can you get higher, there's 3.
So that's a different question, which we'll go on to.
Yes.
Why does New Zealand give so much more than us?
Yes, a couple of reasons are, one of our parts of our policy environment which needs improving is that in New Zealand, if you're registered as a charity, the government says, well, you're doing charitable works, and therefore you should get, when people donate to you, they should get the capacity to get a tax break for that. Yeah. In Australia, only half of our charities have DDR or deductible gift recipient status.
Yeah.
So I've known charities where they were very high caliber charities trying to do great things, and people wanted to help them start up. And people came along and said, here's $500,000 that we want to give you. I need to find they didn't have DGR status, and the people said, well, unfortunately, I won't be able to donate to you.
Yeah.
And so one of the big reasons is that difference in our regime. It's hard to know. One possible factor is about culture. And so you mentioned the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think that's clear, and let's talk about that in a minute. But New Zealand culture, we don't think of New Zealand as culture is very different to ours. I guess in this regard it is.
Yes, it could be. We don't know for sure. They have a lot of money in community trusts that we don't have. Another explanation.
And this is one of the things that is in your proposal.
One of the things we would like to see is a national network of community.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that. And so that's very interesting, in that, and that's something that's developed in New Zealand.
It is quite developed, and they're growing strongly in New Zealand as they are in Australia.
Okay, all right, okay, and then the United States, which I mean, certainly in my head, the United States is famous for a culture of giving, which of course, yeah. So tell me what you know about that.
Well, the data that we have says that for people on more than $1 million in the United States, 90% give, and it's just at 2.1% of GDP giving versus our 0.8. One of the big factors is wealthy people believe en masse. You know, they don't talk about real estate at the dinner party. They talk about what are they doing to give back to society.
I think they might talk about both, but so yeah.
I was going to say, Nicholas.
What's the number? What's the number in Australia?
54%.
Oh,
with more than $1 million, and that's get a tax break. So it might be higher. Some may be giving a little bit, but not getting it through the tax. But it's obviously a different thing. And one of the reasons for this is, I think, a lot of wealth at the top end in America has been there for a long time.
Right.
Whereas in Australia, our wealth at the top end has always been there, but it's accelerated quite a lot in recent times. So one of the big issues is that among the top 200, in 2016, they had combined wealth of $209 billion.
Yeah. Now
in 2023, that's $563 billion. So it's gone up from an average of $1 billion to almost, approaching $3 billion. So increasingly, Australians who are generous and people who are gaining this great wealth are turning to the question of, well, do I pass it all on to my, my successors in my family, or have I got a role in society to give some of this money back, particularly to people less fortunately placed?
Yeah.
And so I think we will see that increasingly happen. It is starting to happen, and I think you're going to get a lot more of it in the decades ahead. And it's one of the big reasons why we think we can double giving in the years ahead.
So, yeah, so you think a lot of the double giving will be focused on the people with a great deal of sort of uber rich.
No, I think it's actually an across the board and national effort. So one of the issues is that volunteering, if you give it a financial figure, by some estimates, it's worth more than all other giving combined. Yeah, and of course, you don't have to be wealthy to volunteer, and Australians of all walks of life give, and Australians across all income streams give. So it is a matter of for all of us. Certainly, you'd expect people at the top end to give more, but a lot of middle class and working class Australians, have capacity to volunteer and give, and they do so as well. So, and of course, business. So, business has increasingly wanting to show customers that they care about the world and make a contribution beyond just their bottom line. And also,
I'm aware of the fact that my stylized fact in my head, right or wrong, is that a lot of the sort of pro bono efforts of professional firms, a lot of their interest in doing social good, if you trace it back to their own corporate interest, it is to get the best graduates, because the best graduates want to do something other than just make money. They want to get some sort of sense that they're part of something. Does that chime with what you know? And what evidence do we have that that's increasing, that that's becoming a more pronounced thing?
Well, what we do know is that firms that do give and give in good amounts have better retention of staff.
Yeah.
And do have capacity to attract the best staff.
Yeah.
But also increasingly customers are drawn to companies that do good works. And you see this in the super industry. So a lot of the firms who are doing ethical investing and doing good works are attracting more and more clients. So there is a self-interest. I also think there is a genuine interest among business. Not every business, but a lot of businesses want to do.
Yeah. I'm not. I mean, when I say the interest of the firm, I'm not doing that I'm not trying to sort of paint that into greater black and white. I mean, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make connections between self-interest and other interests. And I never, that's what you're trying to do, it seems to me, if you're really trying to effectively give as a corporation, this is as opposed to an individual, you're trying to find the best possible intersection between your own interests and these wider interests. And often that can come just from thinking more broadly. So you might do something which doesn't contribute much to the bottom line in any very direct way, but it has some indirect benefits in terms of your perception in the marketplace, but at the same time, some quite strong but indirect benefits in terms of your ability to get great staff and so on. So it's often an invitation to think more broadly. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Just to the second part of your question, there isn't mandatory reporting of corporate donations. And so the answer is to how are we going is, well, we don't actually know for sure. There's some that voluntarily do this and various reports. Yeah. And it seems like some very good efforts are being made. But one thing you could do is require reporting of corporate donations, because if you had transparency, it would be very difficult for major companies to be not giving and that being transparent to their customers, to their staff, and to get away with it. And what I think you would see, and what we think is the case, is among the top 50, there are some giving it at more than 2% of pre-tax profit, and others are giving as low as 0.2% of pre-tax profit.
Yeah.
And those 0.2s you wouldn't think would be able to continue that if those figures were transparent. And there's some great stuff being done. So David Mann in Workplace Giving Australia advocates for workplace giving in Australia.
Yeah.
So employees being able to give to charity through their workplace and get an immediate tax deduction.
Yeah.
And then advocating for companies to match those donations. And I think around 2/3 of the workplace giving companies do match on a one-for-one basis, and that's significant. There's a thing called Pledge 1%. So companies can sign up to Pledge 1%, where they can donate 1% of profit or 1% of time in volunteering, or provide what they do really well and give it to a charity. So if you're a consulting firm, if you're McKinsey, or your BCG, you can help out a Teach for Australia or a Salvation Army with their strategy and actually make a real difference to the charitable sector. So all of that stuff from businesses does appear to be increasingly happening, but I think there's also further upside.
Yeah, Salesforce, I believe, is one of the movers and shakers of the 1% pledge, and I think they donate 1% of profit, 1% of their staff time, and maybe that 1%, I would call that 1% in kind services. So yeah, that's an excellent thing to do. Do you have some? Now, I'd like to talk about some of the financial things, and then I want to talk about the non-financial ways we can increase giving, and I'm more excited about some of those, like various kind of nudges, which I think could be very powerful. But let's just sort of talk about what your financial ask, in a sense, is to clean up the DGR stuff, clean up the so that, like in most other countries, as I understand it, it's much more straightforward to be able to, for charities to be able to say you get a tax deduction. Is that, what other financial things do you want to, do you see as part of the initiative?
Sometimes it's hard to categorise them into a nudge or a financial thing, but
I'll do it for you.
Okay. Am I allowed to talk about super bequests down there?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Oh.
I'd put that under nudge. Definitely put that under a nudge.
Okay.
What I mean by that is anything that just involves changing a routine in some way, or using using existing infrastructure, which the super system is, to say, all right, how can we make that give more to charity? I'm calling that a nudge. And then governments subsidising the process more, I'm calling that financial.
Yeah. Well, I think the main one is DGR for all charities.
And is it expensive for government?
Well, there was a sector expert group that had a look at this issue in 2013.
Yeah.
And recommended a way of doing it. And they found at the time it could be done for in 2013, mind you, for 120 million a year.
Chicken feed.
That did need to have some exclusions, such as religion. You wouldn't want people putting money in the bowl on Sunday and then being able to claim that as a tax deduction. So there were a few exclusions, but if you do make those, you can do it for around about 120 million. So I would presume that would be more like 250 million, in today's dollars.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's good. That's not. That doesn't sound too dramatic. I mean, one of the problems for government is that when you do one of these things, it's a step change. So you could argue, well, in the long run, that will fund more giving, but in the short run, it's really just a change in, people are going to keep doing the same things, but it will gradually pick up. I suppose you can then argue that money doesn't go directly to charities. It goes back to the people who are making the donation. So it doesn't noticeably fund more. It funds more charity through a behavioural, through change, through increases in people's behaviour. Do you know anything? I'm always quite intrigued that different countries have different types of incentives. Some countries have a kind of flat subsidy arrangement, and we have a tax deduction. Do you have any knowledge about what works better?
What I'd say, can I just come back to the first thing and go to your question?
Yeah, sure.
Look, I think in terms of DGR for all charities, there's no defenders of our system that says this charity, for example, if you try to directly alleviate poverty, you're covered under our rules and you get DGR.
I know, it's hilarious, yeah.
If you try to prevent poverty, you most probably aren't covered.
Yeah.
And you can go through all our rules, and it's a classic case of they were added on, they added on category and category and category, but it still excludes half our charities. And
is there not some concern that it's harder to define and therefore easier to use as a loophole, preventing poverty as opposed to alleviating poverty? Is that a background concern, or is that just an excuse?
I think all of this can be done whilst maintaining the strong integrity of the tax system, because you have the ACNC, you have the ATO applying all those rules, applying the rigour, and surely preventing poverty is probably a good idea, and we all know that charitable work is good, socially good for the community, and that's why we give it a tax break. And in New Zealand, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, if you're registered as a charity, you do get their equivalent of a tax break, and that's why we think that this is a no-brainer. And of course, yes, you do as a donor get money back, but if you give $100, you might get 30 cents. You might get 30 cents in the dollar back, or $30 back. You're still down 70, that 30 has leveraged the 70, which has gone to the charity. So we think that's an important incentive and should be applied to all charities.
So now I'm going to ask you a curly question that you may want to evade. But one thing, well, no, I'll put it in a more positive way. Putting my kids through top schools, we got plenty of, well, in addition to paying lots of money for fees, we got constantly asked to give money to these schools. I didn't give a cent to them. They're good schools and good luck to them, and I'm not against, they should be doing this sort of stuff. But this is money that is largely, and sometimes it funds some need-based scholarships to those schools, but it's largely, it largely looks after people who are very capable of looking after themselves. This is the greatest problem. This is most stark in the United States, of course, this problem. And there is a hilarious podcast by Malcolm Gladwell where he interviews, I think it is the head of the Stanford endowment. And I think it's up to 30, at the time, it was up to some extraordinary figure, $50 billion or something. And he said, and he was interviewing the head of the program and he said, how much is enough? At what stage should we not think of this? Why? And so how am I going to make this a positive question? Well, I've always thought that the way to think about this is to invite the Stanford community to say, how do you want to invest this money to address disadvantage and inequality in the United States, and not just funding access to disadvantaged access to this school, but how can you share? So it seems to me that sort of sister school arrangements and things like that could be very powerful. So I wanted to just invite any thoughts you had about how we can, just get your reaction to it, because there is something generally good about communities looking after others, even if it's others in a wealthy community. That's a reasonable argument. But what can we do to try to address this fact and to direct the giving of the wealthy and these very powerful capabilities that a really good school has to do some more good in our community?
Well, some points I'd make are, I think, which organisations qualify for the definition of charity is a proper matter for debate in any society. And you have to draw the line somewhere. And it's really reasonable to make arguments about where that line should be.
Yeah.
I think the second point I'd make is mostly the charities of the 60,000 charities that get support. If you look through it, it's the Salvation Army and St. Vincent de Paul doing great work for people in poverty. Yeah. It's UNICEF and Oxfam, Save the Children doing incredible work, saving lives internationally. It's Headspace, Beyond Blue and Lifeline in mental health. And I could just go on and on about iconic charities that do wonderful work. So if, the vast bulk of what's done is very, very significant and helps people in genuine need.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure that's right. Yeah.
You mentioned, the other thing is we do need a strong tax system and excellent government services. So when you mention schools, I think all schools should be as close to world class as we can possibly be.
Well, indeed.
That's a matter for, significantly a matter for government to reform them, and the fact that we have disadvantage in the school sector is important. So just to jump in there, I guess I'm just asking the question, with our great educational facilities, what can we do? Obviously, the main task is for government. There's no question about that, and certainly in terms of funding. But it isn't just funding. It's also about organisation and skills and so on. And what can we do? It seems to me there's an exciting possible agenda there
to say, how do we get the greatest schools of Australia, both in the public and the private sectors, sharing their skills and getting proud of the fact that they're making a difference, not just to their natural communities, but much more generally.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ways is for the charitable and philanthropic sector to get behind organisations that do seek to address educational disadvantage. And, I mentioned Teach for Australia before.
Yeah.
They're very much driven by the fact that at age 15, the gap between, low-income schools and high-income schools is 3 years in achievement. And charities that like TFA, that get the best leaders and teachers they can find and train them up and get them to perform strongly and lead in low-income schools are really, really significant. I also wouldn't quite accept the slight premise of your question, which is, do we kind of need to start cutting off, for example?
No, that's why, I'm not, I don't think that's important. It's right. That's why I couched it as redirecting energies.
Sure.
So that's quite a good opportunity for me to just mention. I mentioned before we started recording a guy called Daniel Markovits, who I've just been corresponding with, and he's written a book called The Meritocracy Trap. And the bit at the it's an interesting book with some really quite amazing observations in it. And I was initially somewhat disappointed by the thinness of the last chapter. And of course, we all know the last chapter of such books is what we're going to do about it. But there's a proposal in there that really took my. I don't even know whether I think it's necessarily a good idea. Well, it's a good idea. That's different to saying whether it will work or whether it's going to be good for the world. But it really addresses this point, and he proposes. And again, remember the context is a much more unequal set of giving, and he's thinking about these American universities. That he says first, private schools and universities should lose their tax-exempt status unless they draw at least half of their students from families in the bottom 2/3 of the income distribution. Now, I mention that not because I'm saying that would be a good thing to do. I don't know. But that idea, I think, is that idea to say, let's try to get the energies of the elite and focus them on how they can make the whole place better, not just better for that group. I think that's a really important thing to try and be thinking about.
I think,
and I'm not saying you should be thinking about it in this agenda, but please just make a comment.
I just think it's unarguable what you're saying. We've had decline in student outcomes in Australia for I think around 15 to 18 years, according to the international tests. I remember being a bureaucrat, 16 and 18 years ago, being able to say, and I can't remember the precise figures, but we were right at the top in reading and in maths and all those things, and we've dropped right off as a nation.
Yeah,
both for all kids. So
and particularly
educational disadvantage. It's a huge national issue, and we should throw the kitchen sink at it.
Yeah,
but I do it in a both end way. So I think government should be right at the forefront, and the current minister is looking at how to make those changes that can create more educational equity and excellence.
Yeah.
And then I think on top of that, I think it's good that philanthropy backs in schools and universities. And so, for example, the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney have both, through fundraising campaigns, raised more than $1 billion. And I say great, because that's gone into endowments for researchers to get the world's best researchers working on our biggest challenges, and scholarships for kids from low-income communities. And I just say I take my hat off to that, because it means government's doing its bit, but on top of that, you can amplify what you can achieve through the work of philanthropy.
Okay, well, on that note of furious agreement, let's move on to the nudging part of the agenda, because I think that's the most exciting part. It's just simple common sense. It irritates me that we needed a new branch of economics, which we then call behavioural economics, to do what marketers had regarded as bleedingly obvious for 100 years, which is to think about people in the situations that they're in and then try to say, how do we make it easier for them? to do what we think is a good thing. And there are lots of opportunities, it seems to me, for us to do this, and they've just got everything going for them. Not only are they just commonsensical, but politicians really get the opportunity to do great things without some people opposing those things. And this is an area where that's just not the case. So I hope you won't disappoint the great introduction I've given you for these initiatives. I hope you'll be able to sell them but you could certainly solve them to me. So set out some of the ways in which we can nudge people to give more.
Let me give you my top 4.
Great.
So one of them is the choice to donate at tax time.
Yep.
So every year, one estimate says that the government gives back around $30 billion at tax time. And among the people who get a tax return, the average is $2,800. And a number of years ago, the behavioural economics team at PM&C suggested, well, why wouldn't you, when you know what your tax return's going to be, you get an immediate option to say, oh, wow, I've done really incredibly well this year. I've got $5,000. Am I well placed to give some or all of that back to a charity? And you could have a pop-up immediately, and you think, oh, I love Beyond Blue, or I like Lifeline, or etc., and immediately give some money back. Now, a lot of Australians at a time of high cost of living won't be in a position to do that, and that's absolutely fine. But a number of people will. And you'd think if you're giving $30 billion back a year, you'd like to think that this could become a national custom. Every year you say to yourself, well, I need all of it back. And can I give some? And you'd think you'd get, a few billion a year from just that behavioural.
You would. I would.
Yeah. And we've tested this.
Big tick for that one.
Yeah. And just to let you know, we've worked with Redbridge, with Simon Welsh and Cos Samaras. Redbridge. And they're a great outfit. And they talk about influence with integrity. But they've tested all of these things. And the support for it is very, very high. Almost no one's opposed. And then there's sort of a small group of people who say, well, I'm not sure you only just introduced this to me. But the second thing, and probably the biggest thing that we could possibly do, is super bequests. And the Redbridge polling was 75% of the population support this, poll of more than 2,500. 6%, no, they're opposed, and about 19 were not sure or neutral, because it was a new idea. But this idea is very simple. It's just that you go to your super fund and you say, look, when I die, I want this amount to go to my wife or my husband, or this proportion. But I want this amount or this proportion to go to my favourite charity, which happens to be
right here,
DePaul, right? The reason that this could be very significant is that Treasury is estimating that in today's dollars, by 2059, $130 billion will be passing as people die.
Per year.
Yeah, and it's going up. This is a chart that's going like that. So across the century, it'll continue to go up. And
that's great. It's great news. We'll be dying in increasing numbers.
Yes, and it's that is a fact with an aging population. But if you got 10% of that, it's $13 billion. And as I was telling you before, that's our total giving now. If you've got 5%, it's 6.5, and that's a pretty good annual yield, right?
Absolutely.
The other
slogan, I've got the slogan for you, which is, you can't take it with you.
Correct. You can't take it with you. And when we talk to people about this, and in the focus groups that Redbridge ran, people instantly like it. They're like, well, how could that not possibly be the case? It's my money. How could I not possibly have this opportunity? It's also significant revenue-wise, because bequests don't attract DGR status, so you don't get a tax break from it. And in fact, the rules at the moment are that you need to fill out
So just to clarify, so you're saying it has no revenue implications?
It could be done without revenue implications, but to be really clear, the current time, what you have to do is fill out your binding death nomination to your super and say, I want my super to be transferred into my will Then you have to create a will, which I don't know if you've probably got a will, but it's pretty tough stuff to do a will. It's costly, it's expensive, it's difficult. Only 59% of Australians have a will. Then if you give the money to charity, you get taxed at 17%. So the day before you die, if you give money to a charity, you get DGR, you get money back. The day after you die, if you do it this way, you get taxed at 17%. So we believe that.
So it's revenue positive.
Well, if you just made the choice and you kept the tax, it would be very revenue positive. But if you remove the tax, which we think it should be removed, you would have a revenue implication. But
what's the revenue implication? Is the government getting? Is it the government is taxing super? Is it? Does government tax super at 17% at the end when you die?
When you die, if you give money to a child dependent, it's tax free. But if you give the remainder to your wife or husband as an adult, that is taxed at 17. And if you gave to charity, it would be taxed at 17 at that point. But of course, you're leveraging 83 cents into charity. The other really important thing from a government perspective in terms of revenue, there's just two very important things I just wanted to note. One is that there'd be almost no revenue foregone for quite a while, and that's because the reform has to be implemented. You have to nominate, and then you actually have to pass away. So over the broad estimates, you wouldn't see much revenue.
Well, you pass that. So it's the perfect. The perfect thing that politicians love handing over to their successors. So they take the credit, and somebody else raises the funds. Perfect.
But also, one of the things that the government has highlighted is super was done for a reason, and that's to give people dignity in retirement, right? And there's been some schemes that would have taken money out of super before people pass away, and that is not preferred by the government, who want to make sure people have good retirement incomes and live their final years with dignity. Now, the important thing to note about this policy, obviously it has no impact on that.
That's right.
That's because you've passed away. So it's not in any way against the government's direction in that regard. So that's number two.
Yep.
Number three.
I'd just throw in, I think that there should be an ability of people to give some small share of their super contributions into a charitable stream, but that's just me, and we'll just leave that. So we'll leave that, and you get on to your next point. You get on to point three.
Point three is a national giving campaign. So one of the things that came out with the work we did with Redbridge is that charitable giving actually aligns really strongly with how Australians view themselves. We view ourselves as people who support battlers, who give to people in need, who support the community. When times are difficult, we rally. And we've done that quite a lot over our history. And I do think it is the case that if we were to remind Australians about who we are and inspire them with stories of giving, with a national giving campaign, you would turbocharge giving. And there's 4 target markets that I think are really significant. The first is, we've been talking about high net wealth and ultra high net wealth people.
Can we please call them wealthy people?
Wealthy people.
High net wealth. I've never understood what high net wealth is, but anyway, wealthy people. Yep.
Wealthy people. Secondly, financial advisors. So financial advisors often engage with wealthy and other Australians who may have the capacity to make a gift, but rarely raise the topic of, we've noticed you've got billions of dollars, would you like to give to charity? And so targeting financial advisors would be really good. There's some great ones out there really taking the lead on this, but it's not a standard practice, and it should be. The third one is business, and we talked about the business agenda before, and I think business could be inspired to work and give more, including through Pledge 1%. And then finally, as we talked about before, giving is for everyone. We can all volunteer. So volunteering in the mass market, working Australians have a lot of capacity, even just giving small amounts and accumulate to a lot. Now, if you got to those groups and you had a call to action for each of them, which would be different, So, for the wealthy, it might be establish a private ancillary fund, your own trust, and become really serious. For a business, it's, workplace giving. For, regular Aussies like us, it's probably regular giving to an important charity and so on. I think, and giving them the information they need to go and do that well, I think for a pretty small sum, you'd actually get a very large amount of extra giving. And we've seen that in other contexts. So heart disease, skin cancer. There's been campaigns in a whole suite of areas where we've changed behaviour significantly. The Beyond Blue work in relation to
a pink test. I imagine the pink test. The Jane McGrath Foundation has cranked up giving for that particular cause.
Yeah. So for relatively small investment, again, this is a nudge that could really make a big difference.
That sounds good.
The fourth one is really I don't know if it's quite a nudge, but it's a governance reform, which I'm very excited by.
Yeah.
What you've seen throughout our history is mostly government and philanthropy kind of doing their own thing and not maximising the value that they could get if they worked together.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's been a really exciting development, which is the establishment of the investment dialogue for Australia's children.
Yeah.
Spearheaded by Matthew Cox, the Land Foundation, who's engaged with the Treasurer and the Minister for Social Services, was announced in the budget. And basically, they want to invest significantly in giving every child the best start in life. But they only want to do it on the basis of co-investing with government and working closely together. So you do a joint kind of agenda. And in particular, where we can do social innovation and prove things up, we would want to see government come in on the back end. And the governance point that I'd make is, why wouldn't we do that? Lock that down, make that a success. I think it'll be launched at some point in the near term, and then lock it down, make it work. Why wouldn't you do that in other areas? For First Nations justice, have the minister sit down with philanthropy and say, this is what we're trying to achieve, how can we work together? Do it in the arts, do it in education, do it in disability. Right across the board in social and environmental areas, you could have ministers working very closely with the philanthropic sector to work together to really maximise impact. And I think that could be extremely significant. So again, at governance, it's about organisation. It's not about a tax incentive of any kind.
Yeah. It's non-financial. It's definitely non-financial. So that sounds fantastic. Let me, we did talk earlier about community funds. So I thought I might just finish up. I'm intrigued about that. So tell me a bit about that. You were saying, I think I got the impression that they do that better in New Zealand than we do it here. That might be a wrong impression. But tell me about what you're talking about there and what we could do, what its promise is.
Yeah. So in Australia today, we've got about 40 community foundations.
So tell me what a community foundation is.
Yeah. Basically, it can either be in a suburb.
Yeah.
So there's one in the inner north, just near me in Melbourne, or it could be around a regional town.
Yeah. So it's a locational thing, and I think that's very. It's an area of thinking about stuff that don't naturally do, but it's obviously a good idea. People want to make their own place good. And it's a building, one of the ways to think about having a great nation is that it's a nation of great families, great streets, great communities, great structures all the way up. So exactly. That's why I wanted to talk a bit more about it, because I think, it's the way the human brain works that we like. I think the technical term is homophily, or that's liking people like us. Maybe there's some fancy word meaning liking people near us. But this is human sociality works like this. So it's got to be an important part of the story.
So the basic idea is that you give to a local community foundation that could be around your town, your regional town, or your area.
Yeah.
And then they give money on to charitable organisations to do important works. And you can go and volunteer through this work. You can get involved. You can be part of the community foundation.
Yeah.
One of the big benefits is people in regional areas, for example, they know their town.
Yes.
They know what the problems are.
Yeah.
And so they're really, really well placed to invest effectively.
Yeah.
And also they're actually growing at the rate of 14% per annum.
These community funds, yeah.
Which is more than, I think overall growth is around about 8% in giving. So they're a good way if you're looking to double giving.
Yeah.
If you ban this sector, it's very significant. And you're absolutely right. It taps into something very significant. The pandemic has shifted our society structurally in an enduring way, and the enduring change is greater care about your local community, because right now I'm sitting at home doing my full-time work, and I'm embedded in my local community, and many people are doing hybrid work. They're working from home. They're engaging in their local community.
Yeah.
McCrindle did some research recently which said that 53% of people care more about their local community than they did 3 years ago. 6% or something of that nature said, I care less, and the rest were like, I don't really mind. But you can see that people are wanting to engage locally, and it's happening in a myriad of different ways. And so if we can tap that and expand that community foundation network across the country, you both can volunteer and give, but you can also tap into what Dr. Lee, the minister, really cares about, and that's greater community engagement, knowing people in your local area, being in culture that doesn't let people fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
And all that great work that Dr. Lee did, including with his advisor, Nick Terrell, writing his book, Reconnected, which was a book that followed on from Bob Putnam's work in the US on bowling alone and the decline of social capital, and amazing statistics in there. For example, around about 30% of the population report that they hardly ever or never catch up with friends.
Yeah.
About 50% of the population say, at least once a week I feel pretty lonely.
Yeah.
We're not participating as much. And Reconnected's quite an inspiring book about the social entrepreneurs who are getting out there and trying to turn this all around. So an example is Orange Sky Laundry.
Yes, I know. That's mobile laundry for homeless folks.
It's brilliant, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are bucking the trend. And so this is a huge option. A really exciting developments happened for Community Foundations Australia, which is the peak body for community foundations. They've been able to attract a leader who ran the Canadian system, Ian Bird, who'll be coming to and starting in October. And I think he's going to be a really great leader. And what we need to do essentially is strengthen that peak body so that they can oversee the growth of the network, not have 40 community foundations covering 60% of the population, but a much expanded network covering around about 95% of the population. You can imagine if every Australian could go and participate at their local community, which they trust, they believe in, and they can see it doing good works. This is a good way for both giving and volunteering, but also bringing back that important social capital. So it's a really significant option. And we've written a submission with community foundations for the Productivity Commission, setting out some things they could do to expand this network. And some of that's a stronger peak body. Some of it's expanding the network with some seed funding to get more established. And it probably dovetails quite nicely with the government's focus on place-based disadvantage. So, the Treasurer's got...
Well, it should, absolutely, it should.
Yeah. So, Logan in the Treasurer's electorate, there's Logan Together doing great work, but the government's also putting more money into place-based disadvantage. And if you marry that up with a local community foundation, again, would be amplifying what the government can achieve beyond what it can do alone.
Well, look, I think that's a very good place to stop. The one thing I didn't mention, I don't think we've mentioned, is there is a Productivity Commission inquiry going on right now pursuant to this objective. And I should also give you the opportunity to make any last comments that you would like to, and then I'll wrap up.
Sure. Look, there's a great Productivity Commission team The Treasurer commissioned this inquiry, put it in the context of the government's election commitment to double giving. So they're looking for a blueprint from the PC. They've got a great team. Alex Robson's on there, Julie Abramson, Christian Siebert, who's been a great work of and
he's worked in. Yeah, I know him well, and he's worked in Philanthropy Australia for years.
Yeah, and he thought about these issues. He's a national expert. Anna Heaney's head of the staff team. They're a great group. They're going to deliver a really good report, and my hope is the government will respond in the May 2024 budget with a package of reforms, or they may leave it out to December in my EFO after, in 2024.
Well, or they can campaign on it.
Yes. I guess by way of final words from me, I'd just say I think this can be an iconic reform that can forever change Australia, making us one of the most generous and giving nations in the world. We're trying to show that by working with philanthropy, the government can significantly amplify what it can do from when it just acts alone. So government is working on the investment dialogue, on the voice. There's a whole myriad of things that I think are very, very significant. I think of the charities that help millions of people, from the Royal Flying Doctors to the Salvation Army to UNICEF to Save the Children, and giving them more scope to do the great work that they do. I think about the chance for a better wealth and opportunity, a better sharing of it. Should all of this wealth we've created just be passed to the next generation? Or as a society, do we want to pass it on to people in genuine need? I think the stuff around social capital and a better society is really, really very, very significant. And there's just so much in it for government in terms of amplifying what they can achieve. The polling is off the charts. If all you cared was about politics, leave aside the fact that you're going to help millions of people. I mean, this is one you couldn't pass on. And then, I think credit to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer around how they're trying to govern. They've repeatedly said we're going to be governing in a different way, and that different way is working with civil society, with business, and then partnering with government to amplify what we can achieve together. And I think that's very significant. And my final point would just be to agree wholeheartedly with you, Nicholas, which was, you said before, if there's people with surplus money that's surplus to what their core needs are, and they give it to people in genuine need, that is an improvement in national well-being.
Yeah.
And we could do it in the tens and tens of billions of dollars. And you were right to say, $20 for someone in need is like gold. And for people in fortunate circumstances, it's, half their lunch money. So it's really significant. So thank you so much for the opportunity to have a chat.
Thank you, Sam. And you've proven my original claim that there is a $100 bill, actually a $100 billion bill on the pavement, and we just have to pick it up. So let's hope we do. Thank you very much, Sam Rosebeer, for talking to me today.
Great pleasure, Nicholas. Thanks.
Thanks.